Hello everyone and welcome to the fifth lesson of the Web Development Foundations Bootcamp. And in this one, you'll learn how to build layouts using the CSS Flexbox module. With CSS Flexbox, building layouts becomes much more easier. Now, this is not going to be a deep dive, but after successful completion of this lesson, you'll be comfortable with building different layouts using CSS Flexbox. I'll start off by introducing you to the basics of CSS Flexbox using a basic example. Then when we're done, you get to build this user interface using CSS Flexbox. And you'll also get introduced to building responsive layouts, which are web pages that adapt nicely both for mobile and desktop views. I'll also be covering the mobile-first approach, which is styling your user interfaces by starting with the mobile design, then you adapt to desktop designs. So this is the mobile view of what we're going to be building using Flexbox, and this is the desktop view. Since we've covered the basics of HTML and CSS, I'll pay closer attention to the Flexbox module. Most times when getting started with Flexbox, a cheat sheet could come in handy. There are lots of cheat sheets online that you could access or download, and if you just Google Flexbox cheat sheet, you would have a couple of ones. And one good resource of learning Flexbox that goes deeper is this CSS Flexbox layout guide by Chris Collier. And I'll put the link to this article in the description. But not to worry, we'll be going over the basics and the essential ones that you'll be using to be able to build common layouts. So Flexbox operates using the container and children principle. Now, the main idea behind Flexbox is that the container would have the power to affect the width and height and position of its children. This gives us a flexible way of managing children items, hence the name Flexbox. So for this lesson, I've prepared a very basic skeleton that we'll be working with. Now in the index.html file, I already have the reset.css and also my style.css linked in the head section. So this is the reset.css and the style.css, which is currently having the base style for this lesson. And we also have the HTML section. This commented out code is the layout for this challenge, which we'll be creating soon. We've covered HTML, and that's why I've provided the basic HTML skeleton that we'll be working with. If we scroll up, you can see we have a container and also items inside it. So this is the container and these are the children. Now, if we head over to style.css, you can see I've set the fonts, which is not necessary. This is for the challenge we'll be creating soon. And the main thing to look at here right now is the item class, which is the class of the children elements. So over here, I've given it a width and height of 100 pixels and also the background and font color, which is what we are seeing right now. Now, I made mention that Flexbox work with the container child principle. So to be able to position and lay out these children, you have to set the flex property on the container. Now, to set Flexbox or to use Flexbox, we make use of the display property. In earlier lessons, I covered display inline and display block, whereby inline lays out the items side by side on the horizontal axis, and whereby block takes up the whole horizontal line. We use the same display property and set it this time to flex like so. And instantly, you can see our browser updates. Like I mentioned earlier, the whole concept and approach behind Flexbox is for the parent container to be able to affect the children. And in this case, the container, which is the parent element, has the property display flex. And when we save our work, automatically, the items, which are the children, is laid out on a row. And by default, when you set the container to display flex, it lays it out on the row. And this horizontal axis is called the main axis, while the opposite or the vertical axis is called the cross axis. Not to worry, you'll see how all this comes together. But right now, you can see by default, when we set the display to flex, the items are laid out side by side. And if we go to the HTML, you can see this is the container and these are the children. So when we set the container, the children being laid out based on the display flex we set in the parent. We can also set other properties for the parents container, just like aligning and justifying the content of the children. So the first one I'll use is align items and set it to center, and also justify contents and set it to center. Now, justify contents aligns the flex items on the main axis. And if you hover over here, you can see what it says. It says aligns flex items along the main axis of the current line of the flex container. Now, the main axis by default is the horizontal axis. And you can see on the horizontal axis, what should you do? Center it. So it centers this on the horizontal axis. Align items is for the cross axis. So the alignment for the cross axis is for the vertical axis this time around. Now you might be wondering, if I maximize this, there's no need for this, we've already downloaded the fonts. If I maximize this, you can see now we'll be expecting that if we set the align items to center, these items over here should be somewhere in the middle. But this doesn't work simply because the vertical axis doesn't have a height. So we can easily fix this by giving the container a height. And let me also add a background color. And you can see right now, the container has a height of 500 pixels. So on the main axis, justify the content to center, while on the cross axis, align the items to the center. Not to worry, over time you get used to these properties. Now I could also make the height of this container to 100%, and it takes up the whole page. So this is one simple trick or one simple way of aligning items to the center or placing items in the center of your web page. Before CSS Flexbox, this was quite a bit complicated to do. Before I continue, I want us to access the cheat sheets to see common properties of CSS Flexbox. Just like I mentioned, Flexbox has the main axis and the crux axis. And also, we have properties for the parents and also properties for the children. Now, for the parents, you can see we've set the display to flex or inline flex, but not to worry about inline flex, we'll be using flex in this case. So we also have flex wrap, and if you see the diagrams over here, you can see flex wrap kind of like pushes the item to the next line, because by default, when you use CSS Flexbox, the items try to kind of like fit into one line. So for example, if I add additional classes by duplicating, you can see with Flexbox, it tries to fit it to one line. But if I head over to the style and add flex wrap to wrap, automatically you can see it pushes the item to the next line. And not to worry about this space, I'll still come back to it. But this is just how it works. So if the items can take up the current space, it lays them side by side. But when the items become, or when the space becomes smaller, it wraps it to the next line. So I'll comment out flex wrap for now, and also remove or comment out these additional boxes. So we also have the flex direction, and by default, you can see it is set to row by default. We also have row reverse, which kind of like reverses the direction of the items and so on and so forth. So let me just quickly show you that. So we can override that by using flex direction. So if I set it to row, nothing changes because that is the default. If I set it to row reverse, you can see it reverses it. So the last item becomes the first, and you can see 3, 2, 1. I can also set it to column, and you can see it now aligns it from top to bottom. So instead of having it on the row or on the horizontal axis, it becomes a top to bottom arrangement. And whenever you set the flex direction to column, the main axis and the cross axis switches place. Previously, I said that the justify content would justify the content on the main axis. But if let me remove this too. By default, when you use the row, the justify content places the items or aligns them on the main axis. But when I set the flex direction to column, justify content switches place. So right now, justify content is going to be working for the cross axis. So instead of it pushing these items to the center or the horizontal center, it's going to push it down to the vertical center. So if I set center, you can see it pushes it down to the vertical center. So this is something to just take note. And also the align items, this time around, becomes the main axis. So it's kind of like a swap. So I'll remove that and also comment this out. So we also have, I've talked about align items, which is the extra space between the cross axis, and also justify contents, which is the main axis. For align contents, this is align contents. It's quite different from align items. But most times, to create this kind of complex layout, I'll use CSS Grid and not Flexbox. But let me just show you what align content does. So to make it work, I have to use Flex Wrap and also uncomment this. Then I could now say align contents and say, maybe I could say Flex Stats. And you can see if we had more items, for instance, now, it kind of like gives you a way to create kind of like a grid of layouts. But like I mentioned, I wouldn't be using align content, or most times the CSS rule you'll be using would be justify content and align items most of the times. So those are the properties for the parents. Now the properties for the children. You could actually set the order, the flex grow, flex shrink, flex basis, and also align items on the children. So this cheat sheet just gives you a brief view of what these properties could actually do. But when we get to building this layout, you get to see them in practice. So before I get to that point, I just want to also show you other values for this justify content and align items. So for justify content, if I remove this and hold down the control and space key, you can see different properties you can set for this. We set it to center, which pushes it to the center, the horizontal center. We can actually do stuff like space around. If we do space around, you can see it gives the spacing around each item. Let me make this bigger so you get to see what happens. So it gives like equal spacing on the left and the right hand side of the items. So it has a space on the left, on the right, and for this item on the left, on the right. Flexbox just helps you do this by default without having you to set CSS margins and also paddings. So you can see that the space between item 1 and item 2 is kind of like double, because it has both the spacing on the right of item 1 and also the spacing on the left of item 2. Not to worry, you get to see how this comes in handy when we start building layouts. So we also have space between, and you can see it adds spaces in between the items. Now we also have the final one, space evenly. Yeah, space evenly. So space evenly, that means the space between the end of an item and also the space between the item and the next item is the same. So that's why you have the name space evenly. Let's see if we have more. So you just play around with these values, but those are the common ones for that. Also for align items, you also have the same. So if I remove this, so align items, like I said, is for the cross axis, which is the opposite axis. So we also have, let's see, flex stats, which takes it to the top. We also have flex end, which takes it to the bottom. You can see Flexbox just gives you a nice way to handle layouts without having you to manually use position absolute to push it like we did in the previous video. So Flexbox is going to be making building layouts super easy. So I'll just put this to the center and let me put the semicolon. Now, in addition to using justify content and align items to space items, we also have the gap property. So the gap property is responsible for adding space in between each item. And this time around, we get control of the amount of space we can add. So for instance, I could say a gap of 16 pixels. So you can see the gap from this item to this item is actually 16 pixels. We can make that more if we want. So gap kind of like gives you a manual way to handle the spacing between elements. So right now, this elements or these items are in the center of the container, the parent container, and we now have a gap in between each of these items. Now, I want us to head over to frontendmentor.io, and you can see over here, just like this interface. Let's go to this interface. You can see this is similar to what we are building over here, but this is just the basic alternative or the basic version. So you can see over here, these items are kind of like have the display of flex, and in between them you have probably a gap of 32 pixel or thereabouts. The same thing with this UI over here. You have the one by the left, you also have the one by the right, and you have kind of like a gap between them. Same thing for this rating stars. So you can see this kind of could be like display flex, then you have a gap of probably 4 pixels. So you can see with Flexbox, just this basic introduction can give you an understanding of how most of all these layouts work. So you can see the same thing here. You could use Flexbox for this, you could use Flexbox for this, and even for something like this. So in a nutshell, Flexbox at the basic level just helps you lay out item side by side on a row and also on the column. So when we get to building this layout, which is what we're going to be doing right now, this layout, you get to see other properties come in handy. So we'll be using some of all this children property to kind of like make you have a better understanding of this. So head over to frontendmentor.io and start this challenge. And when you start the challenge, you get access to download the assets. Now, since I'm not on the pro plan, I don't have access to the Figma file like the previous file, but we'll be using the design screenshots to kind of like try our possible best to mimic the design. Once you've downloaded the assets, you'll head over and open it up like so. So the assets comes with the index.html file, which kind of like gives you this attribution text and also the HTML text to work with. And that is what I've done in this index.html. So for now, before I continue, let me just clear out this old code or this code for this demo. Oh no, I could comment it out for now. Then also uncomment this by selecting and holding the command / key. So you can see we have the basic content. And also for the style.css, I think I could just move this, save my work. I could also remove this too. Let me remove this since this is common knowledge. Also, in the assets file, we also have the images folder, which is what I've also copied here. We have the images folder, which has the fav icon, which is this icon you can see at the top left corner of the title bar, which is this over here. We also have the header image for desktop and the header image for mobile. So now you might be asking yourself, why do we have two images? Well, when you're creating responsive designs, most of the times the UI UX guy or the UI UX person will provide you with various versions of images. Sometimes it could be one for the desktop and one for the mobile. And now the reason behind this is that for mobile devices, whenever you load this web page on mobile devices, you will be serving a lighter version of that image. So the one for the mobile device would be a smaller image, probably in dimension and also file size. This helps you load your web pages faster when you're using mobile devices. Then for desktop, you have a higher resolution image, which is also higher in file size. But since you're using a computer or a laptop, this would load much more easier than using a mobile phone. This is what we get to cover when we're building responsive design, and we'll be doing that in this lesson. So that is why we have two images. And what else? We have the reset.css, which I'm going to add a link to the description, which kind of like resets all the whole styling. You can see we don't have any margin, padding, and H1 and H2 elements don't have that big font size. We do this to kind of like have control of our design. Then we also have the style.css. Nothing new. We just have this font over here. We have if I head over to the style guide, we have the inter fonts which I've downloaded, of which I've imported to the CSS file. I showed you how to do this in the previous lesson, so go ahead and do that. We also have this Lexent Deca. I don't know where this font is actually used, but we'll just be using, or we'll just be working with Inter. And you can see this is the benefit of having a Figma design file, because if we had the Figma design file, we could easily just head over to Figma, select the text, and see if it's actually using Lexent Deca or thereabout. You can always go to Unlock Pro and pay for frontendmentor.io. It's a really good site if you want to develop your front-end journey. So I would recommend you Unlock Pro and subscribe to the paid version. I think we have everything going. We have also various color values. I won't be covering CSS variables in this lesson. Probably I'll cover it when we build complex layout using CSS Grid. I'll show you how to use CSS variables so we don't have to be copying and pasting and repeating ourselves. Let's head over to the design and see what we're going to be working with. And like I mentioned, we'll be covering Flexbox, but would also be using the mobile first approach, which means I'm going to be designing the mobile interface first of all before I design the desktop version. So let me head over to the mobile and open this up, then the desktop design. Now, since I provided you with the HTML, let me just do a brief overview of what I already have here. And one thing to note when you're building layouts using a mobile first approach, even though you're going to be styling, the mobile first approach focuses on styling, not on the structure of your HTML. It focuses on styling rather. So when you want to lay out or when you want to write your HTML, you should be using the desktop version for that. So this is the desktop version that we're going to be using. Let me also open the style guide since we'll also be using this. Okay. So this is the desktop version we're going to be working with. And I want you to see something. Before I head over to the HTML, I just want you to have an idea of how I laid out this element. So right now we can see, let me make this bigger. Now we can see this card. We can call it, yeah, a stats preview card. And this is kind of like a statistics for something, I don't know, for the revenue, for I think it's a CRM solution or something. So this is the card which is going to be positioned at the center of our document, or sorry, the center of our body or the center of the web page. And this is the card, and it has two sections. It has a section on the left and also a section on the right. And one thing to notice is that this section are kind of like divided equally amongst each other. So this is kind of like this left side will take 50% of the card, and the right side would also take 50% of the card. Now, for this info section or something, you can see, so the card right now has two sections, the left and the right section. So this is a candidate for Flexbox. With the little idea you have, should have kind of like be a container where you'd have two flex items, the item on the left and the item on the right. Now, inside here, we also have a section, and you can see this is pretty straightforward. You have the H1 text, the paragraph text, and you also have this kind of like data components. Now, this section over here you are seeing is another candidate of Flexbox, since we are laying out these items side by side on the horizontal axis. So you just say display flex and you have these three items, and probably you have a gap in between them. So what I'm currently doing now is kind of like I'm breaking out the layout to see how I'm going to be structuring it in my HTML. This is something you should always do, just like how we did in the previous video. But since we are using Figma, it was kind of like straightforward to do. So right now I already have an idea of how my HTML is going to be. And if I come over to the mobile design, as you can see, if we started working with the mobile design to kind of like structure our HTML, we won't be able to kind of like figure out if this image and also this text is going to be, is going to have a common parent. When you're working with the desktop design, we know that this two is going to have kind of like a parent HTML. So this is the mobile design, but I structured the HTML using the desktop design. Now, this is the HTML. And you can see over here, we're making use of semantic HTML. So we have the article. So I'm not using a div tag, rather I'm using an article because I know that these components can be used in multiple places in our site. Since it's a statistics component, this component could actually be in our homepage. It could also be in our analytics dashboard or in our promo page or something like that. So I could actually just use card for this. In our stats card, we now have two children. The first child is the section, and the second child is the div tag, which is a stats card banner. Remember from the last lesson when I taught you about the BEM naming convention for CSS classes, you can see this banner is inside the stats card. So that's why I used stats card _ banner. Same thing for stats card _ content. So the content is inside the where? Stats card. So we have the first child and the second child. So the first child is this place which is called the stats content, and the second child is what? The stats banner. And that is what we have over here. Now the stats banner is empty. It's currently empty. So this stuff is going to be a background image. So that is why I just left it empty. I could actually use a HTML image tag, but I'm going to be using a background image since it's going to be easier at this point in your CSS development journey. Now for the content section, it has the H1, the paragraph, and also the stats card info. So you can see the H1, the paragraph, and the stats card info, which is kind of like going to be the parents housing this individual data. Now, for the stats card info, we now have the data inside, which is kind of like, which is 3 children. And I named them stats card _ data. So you can have them, this is the first stat card data, second stat card data, third stat card data. And the reason why I have this parent is so that I could be able to display them using Flexbox. So remember the core principle of Flexbox, parent-child relationship. So this is the parent, and we could also align and position children based on the container, which is the parent. All right, this is the basic HTML, and you can go over it, or you could pause the video and write this down, then we can write on. The first thing I'm going to be working with is the body tag. So over here, let's head over to the style guide. Body copy. So let's just set the general font size to 15 pixels. And remember I mentioned about rem values. Right now we are currently using pixels, but when we get to building complex layouts in CSS Grid, we're going to be using the rem approach to style font sizes. And I'm also going to teach you a trick with working with rem values easily. So we can see here that the font size is 15. So the general font size, I could simply name it font, give it a font size of 15 pixels. And I'll be working faster for these common attributes as we move on. So what other thing? You can see from the design, we have a background color for the body, which is this dark color. And you can see here, the style guide tells us that we have the main background. So I'm just simply going to copy this, set the background color to this value, and instantly the background color changes. Now, what's the next part we're going to style? So this is the background color. The next style we're going to add is the main heading. This is the white color for the main heading and the start. So I'm just going to set this, and this is just the white color. So I'm going to set everything in our body to this color. Then I could always target the specific CSS classes and style them accordingly. So this is the first stage. The next stage is to desaturated blue. So this is the card background. So let me also copy this, and this is the background for the card. But I'm going to be targeting, let's see what I'm going to be targeting. I'm going to be targeting the stats card content. So I'm going to be targeting, let me just copy this. Let me paste this so I don't get to lose it. Then I'll copy this. Put the period, then inside here, I set the background color to this. And you have the background color over here. You can see the background color. So after that, let's see what else. We can then set the let me add this image. So we can set the stats card banner and set a background image. So I'm going to do that right now. So I just paste this and set background image URL. Then what's the URL? Go to the images folder and see what, select the mobile version since we're using the mobile first approach. Now we don't get to see the image. If I maximize this, we don't get to see the image. And the reason is simple. We don't see the image because this is a background image. And for a background image to be visible, you need content. But since this time around we don't have any content inside this div tag, I could just set the minimum height to something like 250 pixels. And instantly we see the background image. So let me just take this up. Then we can also set the background size, and I'll set it to cover. So what cover is going to do is that it is going to try to fit in within the bounds of the space available. So if I set it to cover, you can see it kind of like shrinks and fills up the space of the dimensions of the box. So we have the background size to cover right now. And you can see the minimum height is 250. And because of background size cover, you see the image tries to fill the box perfectly. So this is the mobile image. And now you might be wondering that in the mobile, this is the mobile design we're currently working with, or this is the mobile design we are currently building. But you might be wondering why this image is at the top here. And in our own design, the image is at the bottom. Not to worry, we'll be using Flexbox to handle all the ordering of this card. Because as you can see from the desktop design, if you are writing the HTML, the side by the left will come first before the image. And that is exactly what we did in our HTML. You can see the stats card content comes first before the stats card banner. That is the benefit of using mobile first approach, but also structuring your HTML with the desktop design first. Now, let's continue with the mobile design. So what else am I missing? Now, the next thing is, if you notice, this stats card has a border radius. You can see the border radius, which is the curve at the edges of the box. So let me add the border radius to let's see, we are adding the border radius to the stats card. So I'll just copy this and do this at the top. I'm kind of like following the ordering structurally. So you can see stats card is the parents and stats card underscore content is a child. So I'm laying out my CSS the same way I'd structured my HTML. I don't need to just putting the stats card somewhere down the line could be confusing. So the reason I'm doing this is that whenever I'm reading my CSS, I'm going from top to bottom. So for the stats card, I'm going to give it a border radius of, let's try 16 pixels. And we don't get to see it. And the reason we don't get to see it is because right now the stats card kind of like takes up the whole width of the screen. So the first thing I want to do for this stats card is, let me see, let me give it a width. If you can check this, it kind of like has a width of 85% or 19% of the screen. So let me give this stats card a width of, let me use 85%. So we can also set it based on the percent. So you can see 90 looks good. 90%. So if I make this bigger, you can see it takes up 90% of the screen of the viewport width. In the previous lesson, we used margin and set the margin at the left and the right hand side to auto. If I set, where's the start card? If I say margin, top and bottom 0, left and right auto, you can see it kind of like centers it on the horizontal axis. 90% and kind of like align the margin or make the margin at the left, at the right hand side kind of like equal. So the browser automatically calculates the available space that would remain after the width of 90%. So if the box has a width of 90%, then the margin on the left and the right would be divided evenly or equally. So that's it for that. Then we also have the padding at the top. I could add the padding to the body. Let's see, I could add the padding to the body. Yeah, I'll add the padding to the body, because if we add the padding to the card, it will actually affect the content of the card. So let me add the padding to the body. So I'll say padding at the top and bottom of this body should be 60 pixels, then left and right should be 0. So you can see the padding at the top over here. So top padding 60 pixels, bottom padding 60 pixels. I could easily do that. I could also check that out. So you can see the body over here, the body. So you have the padding at the top and also the padding at the bottom. You can see it 60, 60, left and right, none. So you can see the desktop version looks ugly, but not to worry. Now, I give this a border radius. Did I? Okay, I haven't. So I'm going to give the stats card, which is the whole stuff. I'm going to give it a border radius of, let's try 16 pixels. And I can't see the border radius. I'll try 32. I still can't see it. So let's figure out why that is so. So let me inspect. And you can see the border radius is commented out. And why is that so? Okay, you can see it is commented out and also has it here. So why am I overriding the style? What is actually, okay, I've already declared the border radius of 16 pixels previously. So let me close this. If you check, we can't see the border radius of this card. And the reason is simple. If you look at the stats content, that is this content over here, that is this text content, we have a background color. Aside from the background color of this content, the stats card banner also has a background image. And now the background properties, both the background color and the background image of any child element, blocks the parent's element. And this makes sense because remember, everything in HTML is a box. So if this box over here, if you can see, this is a box over here, and the box is a rectangle. The same thing for this image. The box is also a rectangle. And you're now coming over here to say that the parents, the container, should have a border radius of 32 pixels. Now, behind the scene or behind these elements, the border radius is already existing over there, or the border radius is already active over there. But since the child element is on top of the parent element or inside the parent element, the edges of this still have a box. So now one way to solve this would be to copy this border radius property and also paste it to the child. And watch what happens. Can you see? The child also has the same border radius of the parent, because now the parent has clipped the edge to have this curve. The same thing with the content, which is the child, also clips its edges to have this curve. But this is not the right way to do this. So instead of doing this, let me undo. Instead of doing this, I could just say, yeah, set the overflow property to hidden. So what that means is that any child or any content of this container, if any of its parts is bigger than the parents, cut it out. That is what this overflow hidden does. So right now, because of the parent says that even though if the child has a square or rectangle edge or a sharp edge, with the overflow hidden set on the parents, it would what? Cut that edge out. So this would now make the border radius of 32 visible. If you look closely, the image also has these curves. But now I can notice that the border radius is quite much. If you look at this design, the border radius is quite much. So let's reduce that to, let's say, 16 pixels, and I think 12 or 8 is okay. So I think this is okay for now. So we can have this edge over here. So the next part I want to work on would be the ordering of these elements. Right now, you can see on the desktop design, this text comes first, then the image comes second. But on the mobile design, the image comes first and the text comes second. Now, I mentioned something about properties of children, and you can see over here we have the order property. So the order controls the order of the items. And you can see here, we can rearrange the order of the items. So the default is 0, which means every item should be at the default position. Now, to be able to use this order property on the child, we first have to make the parent a flex container. And now, what is the parent of these two items? The parent of these two items is what? The stats card. So I could head over to the stats card and say display flex. And instantly, we don't see the image. And the reason we don't see the image is because we've not given the box, the container of that image, a width. But since we don't want this to appear side by side, if I give it a width right now, if I go to stats card banner and give the image a width, it will appear beside this. But since we don't want to make this layout appear side by side, rather we want it to appear top to bottom. So I'm going to change the flex direction to column. And instantly we see the image. Hope this is clear. Display flex, then flex direction column. This kind of like sets our layout back to the original way. So if I comment this out, nothing changes. But the reason I'm putting this is that I want to be able to make use of this order property to be able to kind of like control the positioning of the children inside the container. Right now, I could set the order of this banner to, let's say, since the parent is a flex container, I could set the order to -1. Let's see what happens. And instantly, it takes it up. Now, why -1? You can see here the default value is 0. So 0 means original position. -1 means take it back from the original position. So if this is -1, it means that this second item would now be what? 0. So this is -1, 0, kind of like a graph. But if I remove this, this is 0, 0. So it follows the way we lay it out in our HTML. So that is what this does. So you can set it to, if you set it to 1, for instance, now nothing happens. But if I set it to 1 and I set the stats card contents order to 2, it does the same thing. So the banner is 1, the order of the stat card content is 2. So I'm kind of like manually ordering it. But I don't want to set this way. I just want to set this to -1. That is how you get to achieve this. Let's continue with the design. And I think we're matching it a little bit. So that is Flexbox ordering for you. The next thing I want to do is to kind of like add this purple shade on top of this background image. Now, to achieve this, let's head over. Okay, we have this background image over here. And I want to kind of like overlay a new container or a new content on top of this and set it to have this purple color and also set its opacity. One way we could do this would be to head over to the HTML, and inside here, we add another div card and give it a class name of, say, overlay or something like this, or modal, or you get the idea. But right now, I don't want to add additional HTML into this file. There's a way we could actually target this HTML and insert or inject content into it. Now, this is another pseudo selector, which I'm going to show you right now. So inside this banner class, I'm going to be using a pseudo selector called before. You can see we have, this is pseudo selector like we covered in the previous, I think in the previous lesson or the last 2 lessons, whereby we did something like hover. So we can say hover and stuffs like that. So if I hover on this banner image, I could change something, probably the background image or something like that. But I'm not going to be using the pseudo selector, the pseudo class of hover. Rather, I'm going to be using before. So we have before over here. Does it give us more information? Okay, it does not give us any information. So what before simply does is that it is going to kind of like inject content before this div tag or before this element. We also have after. We also have after, which is going to kind of like inject it after this element. I'll head over to DevTools to explain what that means. But this is before. We can use the double colon and the single colon. An assignment for you would be to go research what is the difference between the double colon and the single colon. So now, before this div tag, I want what? To have a content. Let me see. Let me put ABC. Can you see what happens here? So before this div tag, which is the stats card banner, I injected a content here. Can you see ABC? We cannot select it, but can you see it here? Let me zoom in. Okay, I can zoom in. You can see ABC over here. Now, if we head over to DevTools, right click, inspect, and where's the card banner? Can you see? I can select it from DevTools. So before the content of this card banner, so if I had, let me see, if I had content over here inside this card banner, hello, let me put it in a H1. Before the content of this what? Card banner. Before the content, I insert what? ABC. This is the content, hello world. Then I now insert what? ABC. If I use after, let's see what happens when I use after. Then you can see here, after the content, I insert what? ABC. Can you see, if you look at the HTML here, ABC now comes after the content of this element. With this, we can be able to use CSS to inject content in our HTML page. And with this, we can also style our HTML page from our CSS class. So let me show you what that means. So right now, I'm going to be using the before tag. It doesn't matter because I'm going to be doing some changes. I don't want to have ABC, rather I want this to be empty, and you can see inside hello world we don't have anything here. So let me go remove this since we won't be using that. Then now, I want to be able to kind of like have an element to cover the whole content of our background image. And to do that, I'm going to be using the absolute and relative positioning. So I'm going to set, first of all, remember what I taught you from the last lesson, that if you want to position items inside a container, you set the parents to position relative, then you now set the child to what? Position absolute. We could use Flexbox for this, but I want to use relative and absolute positioning. So the position of the parent, which is the banner, is what? Relative. Then the before pseudo selector, I want the position to be what? Absolute. Then for the left, on the left side, 0, right, 0, which means stretch from the left to the right. Then from the top, 0, and the bottom, 0, which means stretch from the top to the bottom. So if I save my work, nothing happens. But here's the catch. I could now change the background color to, let's head over to the style guide to get the purple color. I think this is it, soft violet at the accent color. So I'm going to copy this and paste this, and let's see what happens. And you can see right now, we have now successfully placed or injected styling before the content of our banner image. So what this does is it kind of like copies this class and pastes it here. Then we can now like customize it using some CSS rules. So this is a simple way to kind of like have this overlay effect. So now we have the background color. We could just easily set the opacity to, opacity goes from the range, if you hover, you can see it goes from 1 to 0. So I'm going to choose 0.5. Let's see how that looks. 0.6 is okay. Okay, so that is just how to make use of the before pseudo selector. Let's ride on to the other parts. So inside here, we now have the styling for the stats content. So for the stats content, the first thing we notice is that all the whole text are aligned to the center. So let's align the text to the center, text align center. Everything is aligned to the center. The next thing to notice is that it also has some padding. So let's add the padding for this start card content. I think let's choose 36. Okay, that's okay. Then we also have spacing in between each item. So for this, I could just simply, instead of using margin, if you remember from the previous lesson, we were setting individual margins. So for this, we set the margin bottom, or we set the margin of top and bottom for this paragraph, and we also set individual margins. But remember, CSS Flexbox handles all these things easily by just setting the parents to flex and handle the sizing and spacing of the children. So let's set the card contents to a flex of column since it's arranged from top to bottom. So I'm going to set the card contents to display flex, set the flex direction towards column. So it's still going to be the same, but this time around, I'm going to give it a gap of, let's try 16 pixels. So you can see it has a gap of 16 pixels. Let me change it to 36 to see what it looks like. Cool, I think 36 looks better. Instead of individually kind of like giving it margins top and bottom, with CSS Flexbox, we just directly like give individual children spacing, which is also controlled from the parent. So you can see the spacing between this and this. If you hold on this, you can see the spacing dynamically. So everything is just flexible in Flexbox. Next, we have the H1 element. So instead of targeting this H1 element, where is it? Instead of targeting this H1 element, I could just style all H1 elements. So if I go to the top, let me just say, so I set the font size to 36 pixels, font width of 700, which makes it bold. And I also reduced the line height to 1.2 to kind of like make the lines tight between each other. One thing else I noticed also is the text accent. So let's create this class for the text accent. And you can see it is wrapped, this insight word is wrapped inside a span so that I could easily target it and style it. So I could come over here and say, so for text accent, I'm going to say color. So what's the color? Violet. And instantly we have it styled. So we have our general styling. Those are for elements. Utility styling, that's for specific classes. And we now have the stats card. Now this TXT accent, the beauty about having utility classes is that right now I could target any text in my document. So for instance, now I could just apply this utility class called TXT accent to this paragraph, and instantly we have it styled. Instead of you coming to create a separate class for this paragraph and add more stylings to it. So utility classes can be reused. So for instance, this TXT accent can be used anywhere I want to have this accent text. I think we're done with that. The next thing would be the paragraph section. So if I head over to the design, the paragraph text font size is correct, but the font color, let's see the font color. Can you see for the main paragraph, this is the color we're going to be using. So I could just come here and style the whole P tags to have this color. So I'll say color and save. And now all the whole P tags have this color. What else? The line height looks okay to me. If there's any change, I could always come and change it up. So we have this. That is cool. Then we also have the H3, which is inside here. Now comes the question, should we style all the whole H3? I think we should style all the whole H3. So I could either come over here and target this one specifically, or I'll just style the H3. Everything just depends on any approach you want. So I could say for all the H3, The font size should be 24 pixels. And the fonts, let me check the desktop design. It doesn't matter for now. And the font weight should be also bold. And the reason I know about this is you can see the font weight they give us here, both 400 and 700. And that is why I'm using those values. So H3, font weight 24 and also bold. Which other thing? Okay, the next one will be to make, let's see, stats card info. That is this whole group. I'm going to also use Flexbox for that. We could always use margin and set the margin of this middle one to top and bottom. But you should ask yourself, what if this content is dynamic? What is if it is coming from an online resource or a database? Right now, it is only 3 elements. But what if there are 20 elements? If we use CSS to just target this second element, it is not going to scale when we have more than 3 elements. So with CSS Flexbox, you can be dynamic, or you can apply dynamic styling that is going to scale irrespective of the number of the children. So I'm going to make the container over here a flex container. So I'm going to go down. So start content, then I'll know start content info. Then over here, I'd say flex direction column, then I could give a gap. So no need for margins now. I could give a gap of 16 pixel. Let me see. Is there another thing we're missing out? So let's target the stats card data. Remember, we can always override style. So we can always override this H3 styling we did previously. Because of what? CSS specificity. Stats card data. What am I targeting data? The text should be uppercase. Let's say text transform property. Uppercase. And everything is uppercase. So this is uppercase, uppercase, uppercase. But this K over here is not uppercase. So I could manually override the casing for this particular one. Now, I want to make this text over here to be lowercase. Right now, I've already created the stats card info and said that everything inside the stat card should be uppercase. And as you can see, everything is uppercase, both the paragraph and the H3. But now I want to target this first element. I could use pseudo class selectors, but I could just simply give this one a utility class called lowercase. Then this first one is going to have a utility class called lowercase. Then I could head over to style in my utilities class section and have this lowercase and I save. So you can see now automatically now this K becomes lowercase thanks to utility classes. Wherever in my design I want to add lowercase into a particular text, I'll just simply add the style. And one thing in CSS, I don't know if I mentioned, you can actually add more than one class to an element. So you could add different classes like so. So different classes for different reasons. So we have this already sorted out. And let me see, I think the line height of this is not really adding up. So let me head over to the line height. So what is that? It's going to be what? Start card contents P. Start card contents P. So I could set the line height to, the default line height is 1.5. So I could set it to 1.7. And I think this spacing is looking much more better. Cool. Now, the next thing, if I'm missing anything, am I missing anything? The next thing is going to be targeting this text inside the stats card data. So I'm going to target the P inside there and say, I think I should also reduce the font size. The color of this is different. Let's take a look at the style guide. This is stats heading. Okay, this should even be the heading. It's actually correct. This is the heading. This stuff over here is the heading and not this. So the naming is kind of like confusing. So this should be for this. Let me comment this out. This should be for this. Let me remove the font size. Okay, and we have it correct now. This is the stats info heading, while the stats itself is white. So this is correct. So the heading is this. But this text is looking okay. I think this is okay. This is where the second font comes in. Let's take a look at this. If we zoom in, this is where the second font comes in, because if you look closely, you can see that this font is different from this font. So in the style guide, what's the name of this second font? Let me copy it and head over to add the font, get embed code, use the import statements, head over to the top. Then we'd also copy this for this one. So for the heading, let's see. So I'm going to set the font family to this. Is it not imported correctly? Okay, let me refresh my page. Let me reload my page. Okay, so when you do that, you just need to reload the page, and let's confirm the font. And this is the correct font. So you can see now, this is the correct font, the Lex End font. So let's scroll down, and so everything is looking okay right now. Let me remove this. So we fixed the mobile design, and it's time to create the desktop design. So this is the mobile first approach. So right now, when you go to a mobile device, let's say you inspect, you change to a mobile device, you can see if you open this on the phone, this looks good. So the idea behind mobile devices, that mobile first design approach, is that most or so many people access websites or web pages using their mobile devices. So you have to always try to create your layout in such a way that it adapts nicely to mobile device, so you don't get to see all those annoying scroll bars. So this looks good on mobile. So let's adapt this to web. You can see right now it's quite ugly in this in bigger layouts. So to achieve this, would make use of CSS media queries. So CSS media queries just simply helps you to create responsive web design. So with CSS media queries, you can create design based on different screen sizes. I want us to take a look at this. At what point, let me inspect so I can be able to see the screen device width. So if you look at this side, the top right corner of the web page, I want you to see the white device width. So you can see right now, as I'm increasing this page looks good up till this point. At this point, let's say around 7, let's check the style guide. Okay, 1440. Okay, doesn't matter. So at this point, I want, let's say 750. Yeah, let's say at 750. I want to maybe like set the width of this container to, initially it was what? Initially the width of this container was, let's see, it has a width of 90. So at 750 pixels, as in when our device or screen is at the width of 750 pixels, I want the width to probably be 70% of the screen. So to do that, you make use of media queries, and you have them like so. At media, then you now define the screen size. So at the minimum width of what? 750 pixels, I want to set something. What do I want to set? I want to reset this CSS rule for the stats card. So let's copy the stats card, come over here, paste it. So at this point, I want the width to be 70%. Let's see. And you can see instantly the width is 70% at this point. So let me just go. So at this point, where the screen width is like between 500, the width is 90%. Then when I go, I want you to watch that top right corner. When I get to the point of 750 pixels, just watch, you see, at 750 pixels, the container's width changes to 70%. So you can see at this point, design starts looking ugly. Then we what? Adapt it to this screen's width. So this is the basics of CSS media query. So you make use of the @media. Then after that, you pass in the minimum width into this parenthesis. If you are using a desktop first approach, you'd be using something called the max width. So this time around, you would now start with your completed UI. So if the UI was like this, you would now start what? Reducing the screen size to get the breakpoint. But since we're using mobile first, since we already have the mobile first perfect, we are now saying the minimum width. What this means is that from the minimum width of 750 pixel and above, change the following CSS rule. So what this simply does is that from 750, from the minimum width of 750 pixels up, the width of the stats card component should be 70%. So this pixels you see over here is called breakpoints. And generally in designs, there are different breakpoints for different screen sizes. So if you look at our style guide, you can see this is kind of like a breakpoint. So the mobile device should be around this particular width. Then this is another breakpoint for bigger screens. But like you said here, these are just guidelines to follow. It's not a must. You must use this value. When building your layout, you should just kind of like see which one adapts nicely for you. This is the first breakpoint. So if we go, this is the first breakpoint we meet. At this point, at I think 800, or let me just say at 960, somewhere around 960 pixel, our design starts looking ugly. This looks ugly. So at this point, I want to adapt it to the desktop design, which is going to have this layout side by side. So how do I do that? Breakpoint once again. So I'll just copy this and set the breakpoint to what? 960 pixels. Most time your UI UX guy is going to give you these breakpoints to follow, but since we don't have the Figma file, we're doing this manually. So now I could set the breakpoints here to 960 pixels by default. So at this point, I'm saying it should be 960 pixels. So after this, set it to 960 pixels. So this is the maximum width for UI. So let me just leave it at this for now. But this is not the only thing I want to set. I also want to change, if we come over here, if you come over to our HTML, remember the stats card has two children. The first one is the stats card content and the second one is the banner. So for this stats card, we also have the CSS rule that says the flex direction should be column. So right now I want to change it to row. Remember, column is top bottom. It lays it out vertically. So I'm going to change the flex direction of this stats card to row. So flex direction to row. And you can see this one comes to the side, but the image disappears. And the image disappears simply because it does not have a width. Remember we had this problem when we were in our mobile width for the banner. We had to give the banner what? A minimum height of 250 for the banner to be able to be displayed. So if I comment this minimum height, we don't see the banner. Remember, column is on the vertical axis, so it's top to bottom, so the height is important here. But now we are in this breakpoint, this big breakpoint. What is important here? The width, because we are laying out this content side by side. So if I go over here, let me see, I'm going to give this the image a width. But now I want us to make use of a beautiful CSS selector. But let me do this the not so cool approach first of all. I'm going to come over here and say the width should be 300 pixel. Let's see what happens. Can you see the width is 300 pixels, but this is not what I want. Rather, or instead, I want to make use of a cool CSS selector. That is the children selector. So over here, I'm going to use the right arrow or the greater than sign and say asterisk. So what this is going to do is that this is called the children selector. So what this does is that it is going to select all children, that's all direct children of this stats card. So if this is a stats card, it is going to select this and this because these are direct children. But it is not going to select this H1 because the H1 is not a direct children of stats card. So that is what this pseudo selector, or no, that is what this selector is used for. I need to, let me check the name. Okay, this is called child combinator, not child selector. So this is a combinator. So a combinator is kind of like a selector right now, like this is the class selector, then this one is a combinator, because a combinator is like a combination of different selectors. So this is a class selector, and from the first CSS lesson I told you this is what? A universal selector. Then this stuff is kind of like the operator that combines both of them. So in this case I'm saying I want to select all elements that are children of the stats class selector or the stats class. Does that make sense? So that is what this combinator is used for. There are different combinators in CSS. So you can always go to W3 Schools and check for different combinators. So this is the one I'm going to currently use. So what this simply does is that it is going to do what? Select the children. So if I say maybe section, for instance, now, it is going to what? Select all sections that are children of the stats card class. But since I don't want section, I want to use this. And the reason I'm using this universal selector is because this section element is different from div tag element. So with that universal selector, it is going to be selecting all types of elements, irrespective of if they are section, article, div tag, images, or H1 to H6 tags. So that is what this does. So intelligently, it is going to select both the section and the div tag. So right now, I'm going to make use of a CSS property called flex. And this is the shorthand for something I'm going to show you now. So watch what happens. So I say what? Flex 50%. So flex is a shorthand for flex grow factor, flex shrink factor, and flex basis. I don't know if I covered this when I was showing you the simple box example, but what flex grow factor does is, if we head over to the cheat sheets, you can see it here. The flex grow property simply just grows an element. So by default, all the items have a default value of 0, and you can see they all have equal sizes. When you set the flex grow to something like a value of 2, it is going to be the double of the original size or the original width. And you can see here, this child item has a flex grow of 2, so it's going to be double. If you say 4, it's going to be 4 times the average width of items. Same thing for shrink. It is going to be what? Shrinking it by that factor. So if you say a flex shrink of 2, you can see this item is twice as small as the average width of other items. Then flex basis is another way of setting the width. So if I don't want to use, if I come over here and say flex basis, for instance, now 50%, this is still the same thing, but I'm using the shorthand properties to kind of like make everything dynamic. That is just flex shrink and flex grow and flex basis at this point. You can see that the user interface both has 50%. So this is 50%, this is 50%, and we can confirm that using DevTools. So I'm going to come over here and start card banner. Can you see it has a width of 480 pixels? If you look at the top left corner of the elements, same thing with this. The card content has a width of 480 pixels. So with Flexbox, we intelligently kind of like set the width. Now, the next thing to do would be to set the order of the banner. Over here, we set the order to -1. So let's come over here, copy this and reset it. So we can reset it by saying order equals to what? We can say initial. So when we say initial is kind of like resetting it to its default behavior. Or we can just simply say order to 0. That's the same thing. So take back the original order. As you can see, the default is 0. So whichever one you want, setting it to initial will give the default value. There's something I also notice here. If you look at the design, you can see that this card is kind of like centered at the middle of the screen or the middle of the body. So we can also use Flexbox for that. To do that, I'm going to be setting the body elements to a flex element. So let's head over to the body. I'll just copy this. So for big screens, I'm going to put this first. So for large screens, I'm going to set the display, flex, align items, center, justify content, center. And this instantly places our elements at the center. Now you can see that it is looking a bit ugly, and this is because of this start info component. We want to change the flex direction of this start info component to flex direction of row. So I'm going to head over to this. You can see currently it has the flex direction of column. So I'm going to copy this. Change the flex direction to row. And instantly our web page looks a little bit closer to this design. Although we can already see that there's some differences in the padding and the alignment, and we'll be fixing that right now. We already have this. So the next thing to do would be to just set the alignment of, I think, everything. So let's do that at the parent element. So for this, I'm going to be setting the start card contents. Should I set the start? No, I can set the start. Where did we set this? Okay, we set it in the start card content. It doesn't matter at this point, but so I'm going to be setting the text alignments to what's left. When we save, everything comes to the left. We can see we already have some differences in the padding values. The padding looks correct on mobile devices, but for desktop devices, you can see we have more padding. And I think the padding on the right is even bigger, but let's just set the general padding for desktop. So where was this padding set? It was set on the start card, if I'm correct, or the start card content. Okay, it was set on the start card content. So let me add some padding to it. So I'm going to add padding of, change it to 64. We can see the size of this. Let's see, the padding is kind of like getting closer, but the padding right is looking different. So let's set the padding manually. So I'm going to say top right, bottom left. Say 84. Okay, so the pattern is looking a little bit correct this time around. Okay, so for 960 pixels, let me see, let me inspect this page. So at 960 pixels, it comes to this. This size should not be. See, at 960 pixels, it takes the exact size, which is not really what we want. And 960 pixels does not really look good for very large screens. So one way to fix this would be to do what? Have another CSS breakpoint. So over here, for 960 pixels, let's say the width should be 900. So cool. Then let's make use of the breakpoints here, 1440 pixels. So I'm going to copy this and just come to the end. So for 1440 pixels, I want to say the start card should have a width of probably 1200 pixels. So let's see how this looks. So small mobile looks good. Then on large screen, good. This mimics the design better. So you can see this mimics the design. If you get to the desktop view, you can see it's now closely looks like this design. I think 1200 is a bit too much. So I could just, let me see, help your. So I could just play around with this. So this is looking much more like the design. So mobile, tablets, desktop, then large desktop. So you can see the power of CSS Flexbox and responsive web design. So if we take a look at this and take a look at this, you can see they look a little bit alike. Now, there's something I noticed, the spacing between these items over here, the spacing between these items. If you remember, we have different types for the justify contents. So what I'm going to do right now is to head over here and let me see. This last breakpoint is just for the width of the stats card. So now for the card info, I set the flex direction to row. Remember, the flex direction was column for mobile devices. That is this section. Then when you get to desktop devices, I set it to row. But it still makes use of the gap. So let me show you what I mean. Stats card info. I scroll up to yeah, you can see we have a gap of 16. So I could just simply come over here and say I want to unset the gap. So I want to say gap unset. If I do that, you can see we don't have any gap between them. Then this time around, I'll use what? Justify content and say what? Space between. Let's see whether it works. So this is space between. So instead of giving manual gaps, we want the browser to be able to just interpret the best gap for them. So you can see this is now gaps or spaced correctly. So we have these gaps, and we can see the space here is quite big. So let's increase the padding right. So I could just come over here and say for this large screen, you can see over here the padding, we increased it. Oh, okay, that's for the contents. Yeah, okay. So I could just come and copy this for the contents and say padding right should be 120 pixels. And let me see what happens. So for that large screen, you can see the padding right is now much bigger. So if you take a look at this and take a look at this, you see one thing is all about tweaking this to just see that your design matches. Now, one last thing, if you are very observant, is the space between this and this. So remember, we set the gap for, let me go to the HTML elements. We set the gap for start card content. Start card content. Let me go. Start card content. We set the gap to 36 pixels. I hope I did not unset it. So start card content. That is, let me check the HTML once more. Okay, that is the section containing this H1, this paragraph, and this start info. So we set the gap to 36. But one thing we could also do is to probably use the margin. So normally I could teach you a trick of using CSS Flexbox for this, but we can actually now manually increase the margin. Let's see the mobile design. The mobile design, this is looking a little bit the same, but for desktop, let's increase the margin of where? of the stats card info. So let's increase the margin top and see if it adds something. Okay, we already have it here. So I could just say margin top to 32 pixels just to add more. So we have this. You can see we have more spacing between this. Then for smaller devices, we could just say margin top 16 pixels. And you see it has that added to it. So I think we are done with this design. So that is CSS Flexbox for you. So with CSS Flexbox, you can be able to arrange items side by side and create different layouts. But most times, CSS layout is just used for one row or one column layout. If you have complex layout, you use something called CSS Grid, which we're going to be covering in the next lesson. We also covered responsive web design and the mobile-first approach. And you can see over here, we styled our elements to make sure it appears well on mobile devices. Then we now adapted and adjusted our designs to fit larger screens. This was possible using CSS media queries. So whenever you increase the width of your screen, the design adapts so you don't have that nasty and annoying scroll bars you see in some websites. This is one breakpoint. This is the mobile design, first breakpoint, second breakpoint, then the third breakpoint to make sure our design fits nicely on different devices. So you can always make use of these cheat sheets to get to see how these individual properties work, or you can also visit this website to whichever one you want. Then to dive deeper into CSS Flexbox, you should visit this CSS Flexbox layout guide by Chris Collier. It's a very, very in-depth and comprehensive guide on how CSS actually works. This is not a deep dive into CSS Flexbox. This just covers the fundamentals of how to build such layouts. And if you head over to frontendmentor.io, you can see that you can be able to build such layouts just like this. So this accordion, you can see that the body is a Flexbox layout and the component, the accordion component is placed at the center. And we also achieved that in our design by setting the body to use CSS Flexbox, and we aligned it both on the main axis and cross axis to the center. And that is why we have this card in the center. Same thing for this type of design. You can see it's easy to pull off this type of product preview card. If I zoom in, okay. Same thing, okay, this is what we did. And same thing for this type of design, you know it's already CSS Flexbox, and we just have a gap for these individual areas. Same thing for this. So basic designs like this, you use CSS Flexbox, and I believe you already have a basic working understanding of how to use CSS Flexbox. So that's it for this lesson, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.